Inside a fierce battle at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., civil rights leader Jasmine Crockett confronted Marjorie Dannenfelser, a staunch anti-abortion advocate, over the brutal aftermath of post-Roe legislation. Marjorie clung to moral values and empty slogans to obscure the real pain endured by thousands of silenced women. But just minutes later, Jasmine blew the hearing wide open with evidence so damning it left Marjorie speechless. Then came the question that cut deeper than any statute. If a woman can't control her own body, did American freedom die the moment we stopped recognizing it? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Hill, 9 a.m. sharp. The House Oversight Committee room was overflowing. Lawmakers shoulder to shoulder, aides racing with binders, camera crews jammed in every corner. The brass plate on the oak doors read "Emergency Session," but the air inside felt more like a trial than a hearing. The chairman struck his gavel once. Loud, sharp, final. This hearing will come to order. Topic: Roe is dead. Who pays the price? The room fell into a silence that vibrated with unspoken outrage. Seated on opposite sides of the table were two women who defined the moment. On the left, Jasmine Crockett, fire-eyed, unforgiving, her legal mind sharpened by the stories of dying women denied care. On the right, Marjorie Dannenfelser, crisp navy suit, lips pressed in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the architect behind a movement that celebrated the fall of Roe v. Wade. They did not greet one another. They did not nod. They simply stared. The chairman read into the record. In 1973, Roe v. Wade recognized the constitutional right to abortion, preventing states from banning it outright. In 2022, Dobbs v. Jackson overturned that decision, ending federal protection and returning power to the states. Today, we confront the real-world cost. His words were ice on steel. No legal jargon could shield what came next. Behind Jasmine sat a row of sealed manila folders, each bearing a name, a date, and a state. Each one a woman. Some were patients, some were dead, some were still waiting for someone to care. Behind Marjorie stood pages of speeches, faith-backed arguments, and smiling photos from rallies held on courthouse steps. The contrast was brutal. Jasmine's fingers tapped once on the table, her body still as stone. She wasn't here to argue law. She was here for the mothers turned away at ER doors, for the 10-year-olds flown across state lines, for the nurses who whispered, "I'm sorry," when the law said, "Let her bleed." And across from her, Marjorie waited, calm, resolved, unwavering, ready to justify it all in the name of moral clarity. This wasn't a debate. It wasn't about hypotheticals. It was about women, real ones. The room knew it. The nation would soon know it too. And when the chairman gave the floor to the first speaker, the oxygen in the room seemed to thin, because everyone knew who would take it first, and everyone knew she would strike like a blade pulled clean from the bone. Marjorie Dannenfelser adjusted her microphone with practiced elegance. Her voice, when it came, was smooth, measured, almost liturgical. "The overturning of Roe v. Wade," she began, "was not a setback. It was a restoration, the greatest human rights victory of the 21st century. For too long, our nation permitted the silent eradication of the unborn. Millions gone without a voice. But Dobbs gave the voiceless a future. It recentered our values. It reminded us that human dignity begins at conception. And for that, history will judge us kindly." A few heads in the room nodded. Others froze in place, waiting, bracing for what came next. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look down, didn't shuffle paper. She leaned in, her voice low, deliberate, each word cutting through the congressional hush like a scalpel. 12 women, she said. 12 confirmed deaths in just 6 months. Not from war, not from cancer, but from being denied treatment for ectopic pregnancies, from being told to wait until their bodies broke open before help would be legally allowed. She turned her head slowly, eyes locked on Marjorie like a rifle finding its mark. "And you call that humanity?" Her words didn't echo. They detonated. A gasp flickered through the gallery. Somewhere near the back, a woman's sob was muffled by her hand. Jasmine rose, not waiting for permission. She held up a photo, 8 by 10, glossy, clinical. A young woman, no older than 28, pale, eyes closed in an ICU bed, IV lines tangled around her wrists like unanswered pleas. Her name was Kira Samuels, Louisiana. She bled internally for 9 hours because doctors were too afraid of being prosecuted. Her family begged. Her uterus ruptured. She died before the ethics board could even vote. She placed the photo face up on the table between them. Where in your theology does that belong? Marjorie stiffened, lips parting, but no words forming. She reached for her papers, but found no defense on the page. Jasmine didn't let up. You praise the ruling. I've seen the bodies. You worship the law. I've held the mothers. This isn't theory. It's triage. Her voice didn't crack. It rose. Controlled fury, judicial fire. You don't get to write off casualties just because they're inconvenient to your crusade. The chairman intervened, voice trembling slightly. Congresswoman Crockett, please remain on topic, she snapped. This is the topic. Who pays the price? Women like Kira, girls like Emily, nurses who break down crying in stairwells because the law told them to wait for a heartbeat that would never come. Don't tell me this is about values. This is about control dressed as virtue. And for a moment, no one, not even Marjorie, had the breath to respond. But Jasmine wasn't finished, and the room sensed it. What had begun as testimony was becoming something else entirely, a dismantling. Marjorie straightened her spine as if preparing to deliver scripture, not policy. Her voice, when it returned, was even and calm, each word shaped with careful intent. I know these stories are heartbreaking, she began, but they must not distract us from the deeper truth. Every fetus is a person, not a concept, not a clump of cells, a full, unique human being with its own DNA, its own heartbeat, and its own God-given rights. She folded her hands neatly, the corners of her lips tilting in a smile more resolved than warm. To deny fetal personhood is to deny human dignity at its most vulnerable. Dobbs gave us the chance to protect the voiceless. That is not oppression, that is moral clarity. There was no applause, no shift in tone, just a beat of quiet, a prelude to something sharper. Jasmine exhaled once, softly, but when she looked up, the steel in her eyes was unmistakable. So let me ask plainly, she said, her voice low but unflinching. If a fetus is a person, then what does that make the woman? Her question didn't ask for an answer. It tore the foundation out from under the room. Because right now, across this country, we're watching that idea weaponized, not to protect life, but to punish it. She leaned into the microphone, the folders beside her unopened but radiating weight. In Texas, a woman named Lizelle Herrera was arrested, charged with murder, after she sought medical help for a pregnancy loss. She didn't harm anyone. She didn't confess to anything. She was reported by hospital staff and taken out in handcuffs. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. It deepened, steadied, like someone who knows the gravity of what she's delivering. In Idaho, a woman was interrogated for ordering pills online after her doctor told her there was no heartbeat. She was 19, alone, bleeding in her dorm room. That's not care. That's surveillance. Her eyes scanned the committee table. This is not theory. This is the state stepping between a woman and her own blood and saying, you no longer get to decide what happens next. And if you miscarry, you better have a witness, you better have receipts, because grief in this America now comes with legal liability. She turned her gaze back to Marjorie, slow and steady, and let the words fall like iron. You call it fetal personhood. I call it institutionalized suspicion, where every uterus is a potential crime scene, and every woman is a preemptive suspect. There was no sound, no movement, just the truth, sitting in the center of the room like a stone dropped into deep water, its ripples still spreading, far from done. But Jasmine hadn't come to this hearing to trade ideology for ideology. She came to show exactly what happens when policy ignores the body and when law replaces care. She reached slowly into the stack beside her and withdrew a plain white folder with a red tag and a federal seal stamped in the corner. Her voice was steady, but something colder now sat behind it, a controlled fury. This document is from the Department of Health and Human Services, she said, holding it up just enough for the cameras to catch the title, Post-Dobbs Emergency Outcomes Report. She opened it with care, not performance. She wanted the words to speak for themselves. Across 21 states with full or partial abortion bans, we have recorded a 37% rise in obstetric emergencies. She paused. Not office visits, not blood pressure spikes, emergencies. Her words now landed like nails in wood. Women arriving with ruptured amniotic sacs, women denied care for miscarriages in progress, women hemorrhaging in hospital hallways while lawyers were called instead of surgeons. She turned the page and held up a graph, sharp red bars leaping off the page. This spike began within weeks of the Dobbs ruling, and it hasn't dropped. Her voice remained low, but each word thudded with weight. These aren't numbers, these are patients, and the story behind every data point is a woman who had to wait, not for help, but for permission. She placed the report down gently, as though it might catch fire from the truth it held. Then she opened a second folder. This one's slimmer, grayer. Now let's talk about the cost to the people trying to save them. She pulled out 4 printed profiles, each with a headshot and brief summary. Her fingers ran across the names slowly, like reading memorial plaques. Dr. Karen Hughes, Dr. Nina Patel, Dr. Samuel Reyes, Dr. Lisa Bowman. All 4 are board-certified OBGYNs. All 4 provided abortion care only in cases where the mother's life was clearly at risk. All 4 followed the medical standard of care, and all 4 were fired. Her gaze rose again, burning without raising her voice. Not disciplined, not reviewed, fired. In some cases, escorted out of their hospitals under threat of criminal investigation, for doing what any doctor with a conscience would have done. She lifted one photo, a middle-aged black woman in a surgical gown, smiling beside a NICU team. This is Dr. Hughes, 22 years in practice. She removed a non-viable fetus from a woman going septic, only to be reported by hospital administrators because the fetal heartbeat hadn't officially stopped yet. By the time ethics cleared her action, she had already been placed on administrative leave. She was never reinstated. Jasmine set the photo down softly, as though honoring something sacred. Then her tone turned to steel. If this is what protecting life looks like, losing doctors, watching women deteriorate while legal departments debate viability, then what exactly are we protecting? She didn't yell. She didn't need to. The numbers had spoken. The names had spoken. And so had the silence of those no longer here to speak for themselves. The room should have been still with grief, but instead it tensed as Marjorie once again reached for the one refuge that had kept her movement alive for decades. Doubt. She leaned forward slightly, her expression composed, but her words cloaked in intellectual distance. Let me be clear, she said, eyes shifting from Jasmine to the chairman. I do not deny that there are painful stories, but these claims of doctors being unable to act, of women dying because of legal uncertainty, remain scientifically inconclusive. There's no definitive peer-reviewed evidence tying these incidents directly to post-Dobbs restrictions. Medical outcomes are complex. It would be irresponsible to draw sweeping conclusions from isolated events. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but each phrase carved away urgency like a scalpel held too gently. Anecdote is not data, she added, folding her notes with meticulous calm. Jasmine didn't respond with words, not at first. She didn't raise her voice or shake her head. Instead, she reached down, opened a navy blue folder, and lifted a tablet from within, black, silent, unassuming. She held it up for a moment, then her voice came low and tight. You want data? Fine. But before data, there's reality. And reality bled out on a hospital bed while policy waited for proof. She tapped the screen. This was recorded with consent. It's not hearsay. It's not a headline. It's the final words of a woman who died because the law told her doctors to wait. The video flickered to life on the committee's screen. A young woman lay in a hospital gown, face slick with sweat, eyes searching the ceiling as if clinging to something just beyond the fluorescent lights. Her voice came broken, carried on shallow breaths. If I die here, please tell my daughter, I didn't choose this. I asked for help. They said it wasn't time yet, that there was still a heartbeat. But I can feel it. I'm going. I know my body. I know it's shutting down. She coughed violently, then whispered, "Please tell her I didn't give up. Tell her I begged them." The screen froze on her face. 29 years old, still and glassy-eyed, the oxygen tube askew on her cheek. The room remained silent. No one moved. Jasmine placed the tablet down slowly, both palms resting flat on the table as if steadying the entire world. Her voice came softer now, but so clear it cut through every breath in the chamber. Her name was Lena Price. She had a 5-year-old daughter named Naomi. Lena was diagnosed with an incomplete miscarriage at 16 weeks. Her uterus was already compromised. Her OB/GYN recommended emergency removal. But because there was still cardiac activity, just flickers on the monitor. Hospital policy, rewritten after Dobbs, barred intervention. She stepped away from the table now, eyes locked on the committee. So they waited. They waited until her blood pressure dropped below 80, until her lips turned blue, until they were allowed legally to treat her as dying. And by then, it was too late. Her tone didn't rise. It went deeper, stripped of everything but truth. This is not fear-mongering. It's not theoretical. It's a voice, one we can never hear again. Not because medicine failed, because the law wouldn't let it act in time. She paused, not for effect, but because the words that followed demanded breath. You call for more evidence. I brought her voice. You say anecdotes aren't enough. I say death should be. The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was mourning. The room hadn't yet recovered from the echo of a dying woman's final words. And that's precisely when Jasmine moved in. Her voice didn't rise. It narrowed. She turned toward Marjorie with the steadiness of a prosecutor approaching the stand. Her tone sharpened not by anger, but by something colder. Memory. You've said you don't believe women should be punished for seeking abortions. You've said it's about compassion, that no one wants to see a mother put in jail. Jasmine let the words hang in the air just long enough to feel like a challenge, not a quote. But in 2011, Jenny Lynn McCormack was arrested in Pocatello, Idaho. A single mother of 3, living in poverty, she was charged with a felony for taking abortion pills at home after she couldn't afford the trip to Salt Lake City. She paused, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't a political operative. She wasn't a symbol. She was a woman trying to survive. And the state came for her, not the doctor, not the supplier, her. Jasmine stepped slightly closer to the table, her hands resting on the folder she had been waiting to open. And when that happened, Ms. Dannenfelser, where were you? Her voice lowered a fraction. Because I looked. There was no public statement, no interview, no denouncement of the charges, nothing. Marjorie didn't respond. Her body remained still, but the stillness no longer resembled composure. It felt like retreat. The silence that followed wasn't strategic. It was the absence of defense. Jasmine slowly opened the folder and held up a court filing. The official complaint against McCormack, stamped and signed. This is the charge she faced: violating Idaho's 1972 statute criminalizing self-managed abortions. A law so outdated it predated Roe v. Wade. A law that hadn't been enforced in decades, until her. She looked to the committee members now, her voice cool but resonant. This wasn't about protecting life. The pregnancy was non-viable. There was no heartbeat. It was about sending a message to women too poor to leave town. She turned her eyes back to Marjorie, and the next words landed like a slow, hard truth. You had the power to speak, to say, this is not the future we want. This is not justice. But you said nothing, and silence when it comes from someone who claims moral authority isn't neutrality, it's complicity. Jasmine didn't sit yet. She let the silence do its work, because in that moment the hearing had shifted, no longer about politics or law or headlines. It had become something heavier, a moral ledger, and Jasmine Crockett had just opened it, line by line. Until now, Jasmine had spoken of victims, data, and silence. But now her target was not just what Marjorie defended. It was how willingly she had traded truth for convenience. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. Instead, Jasmine simply tapped the small black remote in her hand, and the screens behind her lit up with flickering news footage. The video was grainy, a side room interview from the 2016 campaign trail. Marjorie Dannenfelser appeared on screen, seated stiffly in front of a dark blue curtain, microphone in hand. Her voice was clipped, measured, firm. Donald Trump is not a reliable ally to the pro-life cause. He's unpredictable, unprincipled, and frankly, dangerous. The timestamp glowed at the bottom, September 2016. Jasmine let the clip run a few more seconds. He doesn't understand the values we fight for, and if he wins, it could set this movement back years. The video cut. The silence in the chamber was instant and heavy. Jasmine didn't look at Marjorie. Not yet. She pressed the button again. The second video lit the room brighter. This time, it was a campaign rally stage in 2020. Red, white, and blue banners, flags, chants in the background. Marjorie stood behind a podium bearing the Trump logo, her voice ringing out across the sound system with unwavering conviction. President Trump is the most pro-life president in American history. Applause thundered in the background. She raised her hand as if delivering gospel. He has kept every promise. He has stood by us, and we must stand by him. The screen froze on her image, eyes bright, smiling, clapping. Jasmine finally turned to her, voice low but exact. That was you. Same woman. 4 years apart. 2 entirely different truths. She placed the remote down carefully. In 2016, you called him erratic, a threat. You questioned his integrity. But by 2020, he had delivered Supreme Court seats, and suddenly, he was your hero. She took one step closer. Her voice didn't change, but something in the room did. So I want to ask you directly, and I want a straight answer. What changed? She gave the question weight, not volume. Was it your convictions, or was it his power? Marjorie didn't respond. She didn't blink. But the stillness no longer read as composure. It read as calculation. Jasmine continued, eyes unwavering. Because when he mocked women, you stayed. When he paid hush money to cover up affairs, you stayed. When he suggested jailing women for abortions, you stayed. And now you call him the greatest pro-life president in history. She leaned in slightly, not aggressively, but close enough to make the moment intimate, personal, inescapable. So tell us, Ms. Dannenfelser, was it values that led you to him, or was it victory? The silence that followed was not empty. It was damning. As the room exhaled and the gavel called for recess, what no one realized was that the real testimony, the one that wouldn't be sworn but whispered, was already waiting in the hallway, carrying a truth no hearing had yet dared to record. The hallway outside room 223B was quieter than it should have been. Capitol Hill hallways are rarely still. There's always movement, murmurs, footfalls. But in the brief recess following Jasmine Crockett's cross-examination, the air had turned dense, almost reluctant to move. Staffers spoke in low tones. Reporters paced, checking notes and whispering into headsets. Jasmine stood just beyond the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her body was still, but her mind was clearly in motion, replaying every question, every hesitation, every silence from Marjorie Dannenfelser, like chess pieces being reshuffled for the second half of a match. That's when she felt it, a light touch on her arm, gentle, deliberate. She turned quickly, not startled, but aware. Standing just to her left was a young woman, maybe 25 at most, dressed in a plain navy blouse tucked into a gray skirt, a lanyard around her neck identifying her only as a congressional visitor. Her posture was tight, shoulders drawn inward, eyes darting just once toward the press cluster down the corridor before locking on Jasmine's. Congresswoman Crockett, the young woman whispered, voice low, dry like it hadn't been used all day. I need 30 seconds, please. Jasmine's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened, just slightly. She stepped closer, putting her body between the woman and any potential eavesdroppers. Talk, she said quietly. The woman glanced again toward the doorway, then leaned in closer, her words quick but controlled. I volunteered for Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America during the 2020 cycle. I worked under Marjorie's national outreach team in a regional communications pod. Jasmine blinked once. So she's internal, her mind registered. Not some protester, not a plant, not bluffing. Go on, The woman took a breath, her voice trembling now. They knew. They absolutely knew people were threatening clinics. Not just protest signs or angry calls. Real threats, coordinated, directed at doctors, at nurses, at their families. Jasmine didn't react. Not yet. She'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do with a truth this heavy was to handle it too fast. What kind of threats? She asked. Targeted doxing, late-night calls to spouses, letters sent to homes with pictures of bloodied fetuses, telling OBGYNs they were being watched. One doctor in Ohio had her tires slashed after refusing to delay a medically necessary D&C. The woman swallowed hard. We got an internal memo telling us not to forward media reports about it. Just flag them and delete. Jasmine tilted her head slightly. You're saying the leadership of SBA knew about all this and didn't act? The woman's voice dropped even lower. They didn't just know. They coordinated with at least one of the groups responsible. That was when Jasmine's entire posture changed. No longer cautious, now fully still, fully locked in. Who? The woman reached into her messenger bag, fingers trembling now. Not theatrically, but like someone who had been waiting for months to make this decision and still wasn't sure if it would get her fired, blacklisted, or worse. She pulled out a small black USB drive. Standard, no label. There's a group called Life Sentinels. Sounds harmless. They position themselves as community defenders for unborn children. But their private emails, these emails, are something else. They discuss protest targets. They share hospital schedules. They talk about applying maximum social pressure to abortion providers and anyone who supports them. Jasmine took the drive slowly, carefully, like it was radioactive, which in some sense it was. What's on this? 37 email threads between mid-2020 and early 2022. Most are between regional SBA organizers and the Sentinel's lead coordinator. Some CC Marjorie directly. They talk about coordinating rallies, sharing lists of hospital administrators, making sure the doctors feel us at their doorsteps. One email from November 2021 actually celebrates the resignation of an OBGYN who performed emergency abortions in a Mississippi trauma center. It says, quote, "Our pressure campaign worked. We sent a message." The woman's voice cracked slightly at the end. Not for effect, just exhaustion. Jasmine said nothing. She stared at the drive for another full second, then looked up. Will you testify? The woman didn't hesitate, but she didn't agree either. Not with my name. I'm already on thin ice. And if they know I leaked this, her breath hitched. I've seen what they do to people they think are disloyal. Jasmine nodded once. We can do it under seal. Pseudonym, closed-door deposition, protected status. I've handled bigger and louder than them. The woman paused, then nodded. The kind of nod you give when you've just set something in motion, you can't take back. Thank you, she said. Jasmine looked at her, not like a politician looking at a source, but like a woman recognizing another woman who had been asked to carry too much for too long. No, she said softly. Thank you for trusting the right person. The young woman turned and walked quickly down the hallway, back into the anonymity of Capitol Hill's shadows. Jasmine watched her go, then turned the USB drive over in her hand. It was light, plastic, unassuming, but inside it could be a match or a bomb. Aide footsteps clicked nearby. The door to the hearing room reopened. The second half was about to begin. But now Jasmine had something no one else in that room did. Not just data, not just emotion, not just questions. She had proof. And for the first time that day, Marjorie Dannenfelser wouldn't just be sitting in that hearing as a witness. She'd be sitting under oath, with the truth closing in. When Jasmine Crockett stepped back into the hearing room, she was no longer just a congresswoman with questions. She was a witness, a prosecutor, and the keeper of a truth the room had spent all morning trying not to see. She moved with quiet force, every step toward her seat echoing louder than the gavel had earlier that day. The committee had reconvened, but the energy in the room had changed. Staffers were alert. Reporters leaned forward. Even members of the panel sat straighter, sensing a shift they couldn't yet name. Jasmine didn't glance at Marjorie. She didn't need to. Her focus was locked on the console in front of her, where the USB drive now waited. Small, black, unremarkable, and about to detonate everything that had been said. She inserted the drive. The main monitor clicked to life, and lines of text began to appear. Not summarized, not redacted. Original internal emails. Sender, recipient, date, subject line. Jasmine didn't speak for the first few seconds. She let the room absorb what they were seeing. No spin, no translation. Just words sent by real people behind closed doors, never meant to be seen by the public or by Congress. Then she spoke. These are communications between members of Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America's regional leadership and an affiliated entity known as the Life Sentinels. She began, voice composed, deliberate. The organization describes itself as a grassroots volunteer group. What these emails show is something far more coordinated and far more dangerous. She advanced the screen to an August 2021 email sent from a senior SBA field director to the Sentinels. She read it aloud, every word clear, undeniable. Apply social pressure by any means necessary. Letters, calls, in-person visits. Be visible. Be persistent. Make physicians feel the moral weight of their decisions. If they leave, better for the country. The chamber didn't stir, but the silence began to tighten, as if everyone had stopped breathing at once. Here's another, Jasmine continued. September 3rd, 2021. Subject line, shifting the medical culture. The screen shifted. A highlighted section expanded. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She lowered it, and somehow it hit even harder. Begin outreach to religious leaders near facilities offering abortion services. Encourage them to challenge the moral status of doctors in sermons and private meetings. Build pressure across professional and spiritual lines. If a few practitioners exit the field, that's a small price to pay for restoring national conscience. Jasmine stepped away from the podium now, giving the emails space to linger in the air. She turned slowly to face the committee and the public gallery behind them. What you're looking at is not just an email. It's a strategy, a system, one designed not to protect life, but to punish those who save it. Her voice grew more precise, not louder. Let's be clear. These emails do not encourage debate. They do not seek understanding. They call for moral pressure, not in words, but in acts. Acts that push doctors to the edge of fear. Acts that turn hospitals into ideological war zones. She turned toward Marjorie now. Finally. The tension between them was now a living thing in the room. Ms. Dannenfelser, these were your people, your communications team, your allies. At what point does oversight become approval? At what point does silence become complicity? Marjorie sat still. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her posture had shifted. Not shaken, but no longer quite so square. Jasmine turned back to the screen and showed one last email. Dated November 2021. The words were circled in red. If doctors feel heat, good. If they lose patience, better. If they walk away, we win. The sentence hung in the air like a final breath. Jasmine didn't dramatize it. She didn't look for applause. She stepped back to the microphone, hands flat on the table. This is not about abortion. This is not about religion. This is about the use of coordinated fear to drive trained, licensed, life-saving physicians out of their calling. It's about intimidating nurses until they're afraid to act. It's about redefining medical ethics through back-channel pressure and public silence. She let the screen fade to black. The USB drive was still in the console, humming softly. Then she asked the only question that mattered. If the moral authority you claim requires people to lose their jobs, their safety, their voice, then whose morality is it really? The monitors had dimmed, but the words were still echoing. The room hadn't breathed properly in minutes. Eyes shifted, not toward Jasmine, but toward the woman who had, until now, remained a fortress of calm behind a porcelain smile. Marjorie straightened her back, a subtle stiffness betraying that the weight of the emails was heavier than her rehearsed demeanor could mask. Let me be very clear, she said, each syllable trimmed of warmth. I do not agree with the language used in those emails. It does not reflect the official position of our organization. She paused, expecting that to suffice, but it didn't. Jasmine leaned forward, not to interrupt, but to listen with surgical stillness, as if waiting for something real, something human. None came, so Jasmine rose. No notes, no hesitation. Just the calm fury of someone who had seen too many lives treated like collateral. With all due respect, Ms. Dannenfelser, she began, her voice low but thick with moral weight. This is not about tone. This is not about a poor choice of words in an internal memo. This is about women, real women, bleeding in silence while your organization nods behind closed doors. She held up a photograph, a young OBGYN from Texas who had left her practice after receiving death threats. This doctor received 37 voicemails in 1 week, not one of them from your group, but all of them inspired by your campaigns. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from restraint, as she laid the photo on the table. You want to distance yourself from the wording? Fine, but show me where you condemn the intent. Show me the press release, the tweet, the whisper, anything. Her voice broke, just enough to sound human, just enough to carry the weight of the women no longer able to speak for themselves. You can disown the words, Marjorie, but you cannot disown the silence. She leaned in, the room hanging on every breath. Because silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity. And when women are dying, silence is violence dressed in pearls and prayer. No rebuttal came. Only the sound of truth settling into the air like judgment. When the final email faded from the screen and Jasmine's voice retreated into silence, it was clear the chamber had reached its boiling point. But just before the pressure could be released, the doors cracked open again, ushering in not noise, but something heavier, truth in its smallest, most unexpected form. She walked in like a ghost, thin frame, oversized hoodie, shoes scuffed from too many quiet miles. She didn't look like a headline or a threat, just a girl. But as she stepped toward the center aisle, dragging every eye in the room with her, something inside the atmosphere shifted, like the oxygen had been exchanged for glass. The chairman glanced toward Crockett, puzzled. She gave a single, nearly imperceptible nod. The chairman leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Is this your witness? Jasmine rose slowly. Mr. Chairman, she said, voice steady, with the committee's consent, I'd like to introduce an unscheduled speaker, someone whose life was altered by the very policies under discussion today. The girl didn't sit right away. She took a moment to steady her breath. The microphone waited like a coiled wire. Her name was Lily. That's what the record would call her. Just Lily. No last name, no city. She had chosen anonymity, but not invisibility. Not anymore. I'm here, she began, because I wasn't supposed to be. Her voice was quiet but unnervingly clear. It rang through the marble-paneled room like it belonged there. Because it did. I'm 15. I live in Ohio. I go to school. I used to play violin. That changed. She paused, gripping the edge of the table. Something happened to me last year. I'm not going to describe it, because I shouldn't have to. But what came after was worse in some ways. Not the physical part. The decisions, the silence, the fact that people like you, she looked toward the witness stand, wrote laws that treated my body like it belonged to the state. Someone shifted in their seat. No one spoke. I became pregnant. I didn't want to be. I didn't ask for it. I was scared. And then I was told that no one in my state could help me unless I was dying. A long breath. I wasn't dying yet, so they told me to wait. The silence deepened. But we couldn't wait. My mom found someone who would take us in Illinois. We drove 9 hours in the middle of the night. I missed 3 days of school. We borrowed money. And when I got there, the doctor said if we'd waited another week, I might have needed surgery. Or worse. Her voice cracked, but didn't break. Why am I telling you this? Because you don't see us. You talk about babies and morality, but you don't talk about what it means for someone like me. You don't talk about how I have to live after. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded sonogram. Not to shock, to testify. This is from that clinic. I keep it. To remind myself I survived. A tear ran down her cheek and she let it. I'm not ashamed. I'm angry. I didn't do anything wrong. But somehow I'm the one who had to cross state lines in the dark, whisper secrets to strangers, and hope they believed I was worth helping. Her voice lowered. If I had stayed, I might not be here. The room froze. Even the camera shutters seemed to pause. Lily continued, but now with a new clarity, like something had crystallized inside her. I don't want to be part of anyone's campaign or platform. I don't need a hero. I just want to be left alone to be a kid, to heal. And I want people like me to be seen, not as cautionary tales, but as human beings. She turned slightly, not toward Jasmine, but toward Marjorie. You say this is about life, but mine almost ended. The words hit with the precision of a courtroom closing argument, not shouted, delivered. Then, without fanfare, Lily folded the ultrasound, stood up, and left the hearing room the way she came, quiet, unguarded, with no security detail, no entourage, and no applause. But her absence screamed louder than her presence ever could. The chairman didn't gavel for recess. No one dared move. Jasmine remained still, her fingers resting gently on the wood of the desk, as if anchoring herself to reality. Marjorie sat rigid, her hands curled into fists on her lap. She looked down, not in defeat, but in calculation. It wasn't the story she expected to defend against. A child with no agenda had just said what no legal brief or Senate speech ever could, that there is a cost to every crusade, and sometimes that cost is borne by those too young to vote, too small to fight, and too brave to stay quiet. Jasmine didn't speak again right away. She didn't need to, because for the first time since the hearing began, the room finally understood. This wasn't about theory, it was about consequences, about names and faces and traumas tucked between state lines and policy memos. And once you've seen that kind of truth, you can't unsee it. As the committee recessed and the heavy doors sealed behind Lily, the silence she left behind began to metastasize, not only inside the chamber, but in every newsroom, living room, and digital feed across the country. What she had said couldn't be unheard, and what followed couldn't be stopped. It began with a single local reporter outside the committee room, still catching her breath, voice trembling as she summarized the morning's hearing for a midday broadcast. The camera cut to her just as Lily's testimony ended. Her words were simple. A child just gave the country a moral reckoning. If you weren't in the room, you need to pay attention now. Within 90 minutes, the hearing footage, particularly the moment Lily held up the blurry black and white image, made its way to every national network. CNN looped the clip with only ambient music in the background. MSNBC ran a full contextual breakdown, including the timeline of the law in Ohio that forced the girl to flee across state lines. Even Fox News, reluctant at first, eventually aired a heavily edited version of the moment, followed by a visibly uncomfortable panel, scrambling to reframe it. But the impact was already irreversible. By mid-afternoon, every major newspaper updated their front-page headlines. The Washington Post called it "The Day the Debate Changed." Politico ran an urgent bulletin from Capitol Hill, citing staffers who described the hearing as the most emotionally devastating in years. NBC, ABC, CBS all followed with wall-to-wall coverage. Inside their newsrooms, something had shifted. Producers began pulling old clips of Jasmine's previous hearings, her clashes with judges, her confrontations with power. For years, she had been cast as a firebrand, a disruptor. Now they framed her as a reluctant crusader, one who didn't seek the moment but was clearly built for it. And at the center of it all was a child, a girl with shaking hands and defiant eyes, holding a sonogram and speaking about mortality. Late that night, a long-form op-ed published in The Atlantic stunned even the most jaded readers. Written by an anonymous pediatric ER doctor from Indiana, it recounted an eerily similar case. A 12-year-old collapsed in pain, turned away by two hospitals, eventually airlifted. But too late. The doctor's closing line hit like a hammer. When politics rewrites medical ethics, it's not law, it's cruelty in costume. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. Lawyers for Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America, once smug in their legal distance, were now in emergency meetings. Internal emails, obtained and verified through encrypted sources, confirmed what Jasmine had already made public. Conversations between staffers and extremist groups that advocated for targeted social disruption of doctors, hospital boards, and clinics. The phrase, strategic intimidation, appeared 5 times across the emails. One message, sent at 2:43 a.m. from a junior aide, had simply said, "We can't keep pretending we don't know." And then came the public statement, dry, mechanical, preemptively defensive. Our organization affirms its long-standing position against violence or coercion. We categorically reject any affiliation with fringe activist groups. We support peaceful advocacy and legislative change. But no one was convinced, because it wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about proof, about choices made behind closed doors, and the consequences that played out on operating tables, in emergency rooms, in the hushed aftermath of ambulance sirens that came too late. By the second day, national pressure was in full throttle. Journalists began to dig deeper into the history of Life Sentinels, the group exposed in the email chain. What they uncovered was chilling. Years of online forums, encrypted message chains, private donor networks. Former members came forward anonymously. Some described being told to stand outside hospitals and document which doctors entered abortion clinics. Others recalled being encouraged to send anonymous threats. One whistleblower described a training session where attendees were told, "The law won't save us. Fear will." Suddenly, the line between belief and extremism had a face, and that face stood dangerously close to Marjorie Dannenfelser. The Republican presidential candidate for whom she had served as policy architect tried to distance himself. First through silence, then through his communications director, who told a reporter off camera, "She's off the campaign. That's all I can say." Hours later, it was confirmed. Marjorie had been removed from her role as chief advisor on reproductive policy. There was no public statement from her, no interview, no rebuttal. For the first time in over a decade, her voice vanished from the Sunday talk show circuit, her usual interviews pulled, her quotes scrubbed from campaign websites. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stood on the steps of the Capitol, not gloating, not triumphant, but steady. When a reporter asked her what came next, she answered, accountability. Not just for the policymakers, for the silence, for the threats, for every girl who thought she was alone until now. In a small conference room a few blocks away, a group of young aides reviewed footage of the hearing for a documentary project. One paused the video at the moment Lily said, "If I kept the baby, we might have both died." The still image hung on the screen. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. They didn't need to. Across the country, pediatric clinics received letters of support. Doctors long silenced by fear spoke publicly for the first time. A small town in Illinois held a candlelight vigil, not just for Lily but for others like her, those whose stories were buried under statutes and shame. And yet none of this had started with legislation or legal briefs. It had started with a child, then a folder, then a name, and one woman who refused to look away. The hearing room had emptied, but the nation was still holding its breath. What began as a congressional clash had spilled into the bloodstream of American conscience. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped out under the afternoon sun, the Capitol dome rising like a shadow behind her, she wasn't just a congresswoman. She was the echo of 1,000 unheard voices, and she knew the cameras were rolling. She stood before a chaotic press swarm outside the Capitol, reporters jostling, flashes erupting like gunfire, boom mics trembling in the breeze. The podium bore no seal, no protective barrier separated her from the moment. Jasmine Crockett faced them alone, sleeves rolled, eyes unflinching. The silence before she spoke was not hesitation. It was precision. "This is not about Marjorie," she began, her voice low but firm, slicing clean through the noise. "It never was. This is about something far older and far more dangerous than one person. It's about the culture that uses morality like a leash." Every word landed like a verdict. A culture that claims to protect life, but only once it has power over yours. A culture that calls itself righteous while women bleed out in parking lots. She didn't look at notes. There were none. We've watched people hide behind faith while funding silence. We've seen lawmakers praise God from a pulpit and then dodge every question about a dying girl from Ohio. She paused just long enough for her eyes to scan the sea of cameras. You can call it conviction, but I've seen what it really is. It's fear. Fear that if women decide for themselves, your illusion of control crumbles. A reporter asked if this was personal. Jasmine didn't smile. It's personal because I've held the hand of someone forced to carry pain for the comfort of others. Her voice cracked, but not with weakness. It was the kind of crack that happens before a dam breaks. It's personal because I've seen a nurse whisper, "I'm sorry, we can't touch her yet." While the law watched her die, she leaned slightly forward. And now you ask me if I'm angry? I'm beyond angry. I'm focused. The crowd stilled. No one interrupted. The question isn't whether I'm at war with Marjorie. The question is whether we're finally willing to admit what this fight actually is. A battle between the performance of virtue and the preservation of life. Behind her, an aide adjusted a microphone cord, pale and shaking. Jasmine didn't flinch. They used to burn women like me for being too loud, too smart, too unwilling to kneel. Now they just pass laws and call it tradition. Her hands clenched slightly at the edge of the podium. Let me be clear. If standing up for girls who are too young to testify makes me dangerous in their eyes, I'll wear that threat like armor. A final pause. Then the line that would lead every broadcast that evening. This was never about saving lives. It's always been about controlling them. And I won't stop until that grip is broken. As Crockett stepped out of the Capitol's shadow into a nation forever altered by her testimony, the ripple she set in motion became a tidal wave, one that would now crash into the very institutions that allowed silence to become policy. Within 48 hours, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Liberties called for an emergency investigation. What had begun as a confrontation between two political figures now threatened to unveil the hidden machinery behind American reproductive policy. The room where the inquiry was held, room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building, had seen its share of battles. But that morning it felt like a courtroom for the soul of the country. The walls bore portraits of lawmakers long gone, silent witnesses to a reckoning they never imagined. Staffers rushed to set up projectors, document troves were wheeled in under tarps, and security doubled outside the chamber. Not for fear of violence, but because truth, at this level, often drew desperate defenders. A single banner hung at the back. Public policy must serve public good. The irony was bitter. Congresswoman Crockett was not seated at the table this time. She was in the gallery, an observer, a trigger, a symbol. Instead, former state legislators, health professionals, and a whistleblower from inside a major pro-life lobbying organization took the witness stand. The first witness, Dr. Elaine Monroe, pulled out a ledger of anonymous patient testimonies, women forced across state lines, OB/GYNs resigning under threat, and hospitals turning away emergencies due to fear of criminal liability. They call it moral leadership, she said, her voice shaking, but it's just controlled fear wrapped in scripture. The committee room didn't move. Even the lights seemed to dim. There was no outrage left to perform, only stunned absorption. The whistleblower, identified only as Mr. L, revealed that over $42 million had been funneled from 3 tax-exempt nonprofit groups directly into state campaigns, each demanding legislative loyalty in return. Screens lit up with maps showing synchronized bill introductions across multiple legislatures. Matching phrases, matching timing, matching donors. This wasn't democracy, he said, as digital lines connected lobbyist memos to gubernatorial endorsements. It was a corporate colonization of women's autonomy. When asked why he came forward now, he simply said, "Because no one came for my sister when she begged." His voice cracked. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. By mid-afternoon, a previously sealed subpoenaed cache was projected on the main screen. It contained internal strategy decks from a consulting firm hired by a faith-aligned think tank. The slides were brutal in clarity. Reframe reproductive control as national identity preservation. Use fear of cultural decline to push emergency policy through State House. One line, bold, underlined, froze the room. Liberty can be sacrificed temporarily for moral clarity. That sentence, once hidden behind passwords and private Zooms, now blazed across federal records. No one looked away. Some looked down. The climax came when Congresswoman Lillian Rhodes, a veteran lawmaker who had long stood at the sidelines on abortion debates, stood to address the room. She was 72, a moderate, a centrist, a compromiser. But not today. She placed both hands on the witness table and leaned forward. "We were elected to guard liberty, not mortgage it to whoever writes the largest check," she said. "This isn't just about abortion anymore. It's about whether democracy is still breathing through a woman's lungs." She turned her head slowly, looking each of her colleagues in the eye. Some winced, some nodded, some pretended to take notes. Then, the final moment came. Congressman Ramirez, a quiet first-term representative from Arizona, requested to speak. He had barely spoken in prior sessions, but today his words cut through like a scalpel. He leaned into his microphone, his voice calm and deliberate. "I have just one question," he said. He held up a black and white photo of a woman holding her newborn, wrapped in blankets from a hospital that no longer performed emergency abortions. "If a woman cannot choose what happens to her own body, then tell me, when did American freedom die?" There was no rebuttal, no procedural objection, no sound at all. Just that question, echoing through the chamber, through every news feed, into dinner tables and dorm rooms and hospitals across the nation. And outside on the steps of Congress, Jasmine Crockett stood in the cold evening light, watching, waiting, knowing full well that no matter how loud the gavel struck, some truths needed a witness, not just a verdict. The air outside Congress felt different that night, thick with the weight of something irreversible. What began as a political hearing had transformed into something far deeper, something ancestral. It wasn't about statutes or sound bites anymore. It was about the human soul colliding with the machinery of power and refusing to be erased. Jasmine Crockett had entered that room with documents, evidence, and a plan. But what she carried beneath her blazer, rage, memory, and moral clarity, became the real weapon. She had not come to win an argument. She had come to reclaim ground long stolen. And in doing so, she didn't just stand for the women in the headlines. She stood for every girl whose choices were stolen in silence, every mother who buried truth to survive, and every woman who'd ever been told that her freedom must come second to someone else's fear. There was no applause. There were no victory speeches. But across the country, in living rooms, in hospital break rooms, in college dorms and shelter basements, people watched her and understood something they hadn't dared to name aloud. That in America, the battle for control of a woman's body was never just about policy. It was about punishment. And Jasmine had dared to flip the script. She held up the mirror and forced the nation to look, not at her, but at itself. And what stared back wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. One that asked, how long can you call yourself free when half your people live under conditions they didn't choose? This is the lesson we avoid because it terrifies us. That freedom is not permanent. It can be papered over by laws, corrupted by lobbying, and destroyed. Not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet votes and whispered backroom promises. Jasmine didn't come to make noise. She came to tear down the illusion that morality is neutral, that it can be dictated by the powerful without cost to the powerless. She exposed the rot beneath the polished floorboards, showed that in America it is entirely possible to speak of liberty while legislating control. She didn't cry, she didn't plead. She let the evidence speak, then let the silence finish the sentence. And in that silence, millions heard something new and horrifyingly familiar. Because here is the bitter truth. Injustice doesn't always wear a hood or carry a torch. Sometimes it sits in office. Sometimes it preys on camera. Sometimes it smiles and tells you it's for your own good. Jasmine knew that, and she fought anyway. Not with anger, but with purpose. Each question like a blade, each fact like a spark. She forced open a door long bolted shut, and behind that door was the truth we never wanted to face, that what's legal is not always what's right, and what's popular is not always what's just. So what now? What do we take from the storm she unleashed? The easy answer is outrage, but outrage fades. What must remain is vigilance, a new understanding that silence isn't neutral, that neutrality in times of oppression is a choice to side with the status quo. Jasmine didn't just model courage, she modeled accountability. And not just for politicians, for citizens, for systems, for all of us who've ever thought, this doesn't affect me. Because one day it might, and when it does, we'll remember her. The woman who stared down power and didn't blink. Her final question still echoes, not just in the halls of Congress, but in the hearts of those watching. If a woman can't decide what happens to her own body, then where exactly did America lose its freedom? It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a line drawn in moral sand, a warning flare, and maybe, just maybe, the start of a long overdue shift. Not just in law, but in conscience. Because freedom is not given, it is demanded. And Jasmine Crockett reminded a nation, one painful truth at a time, that it's time to start demanding again. But a reckoning, no matter how powerful, means nothing if it ends in silence. And Jasmine Crockett understood that better than anyone. She didn't fight for applause. She fought for momentum. She knew that if the nation walked away thinking the battle was over, then everything she exposed would rot quietly under the weight of forgotten headlines. So she did what only the bravest warriors do after the war smoke clears. She looked into the camera, into the eyes of a country still stunned, and she refused to let them off the hook. "This is not the end," she said, voice steady but thick with something more potent than anger. Conviction. "You saw what happens when truth is cornered. Now ask yourself, what will you do when it comes knocking at your door?" There was no music swelling behind her, no dramatic lighting, just a woman with a scorched voice, a burning heart, and a challenge bigger than any chamber could contain. She didn't speak to party lines or political camps. She spoke to everyone who had ever whispered, "This isn't right," and then gone back to scrolling. She spoke to the exhausted nurses afraid to speak up, to the fathers who wanted to protect their daughters but didn't know how. She spoke to the silent majority, the invisible allies, the unsure, the hesitant, the almost awake. "If you're waiting for someone more qualified to fight for what's right," she said, "look in the mirror. It's you. It's always been you." Every word cracked like thunder. The live feed's chat box exploded. Phone lines at advocacy centers lit up. The fire she lit wasn't rhetorical. It was real, and it was already spreading. Crockett didn't issue a plea. She issued a blueprint. She named organizations, websites, local efforts in red states and swing states, and said, don't just donate, don't just post, embed, show up to meetings, speak at school boards, ask your state rep who's funding their bills. Don't just vote, organize before the ballot. It wasn't performative, it was surgical. She knew the playbook being used against people like her, well-funded, deeply networked, relentlessly patient. And she dared the people watching not to be outraged, but to be disciplined. "Rage without strategy is a tantrum," she said, "and I don't have time to babysit democracy anymore." The crowd didn't cheer. They stood, not for her, but for themselves. And for the first time in years, it felt like something was shifting. That maybe the tired weren't just tired, maybe they were ready. The hearings weren't just televised, they were studied, dissected, replayed in classrooms and town halls. High school debate teams broke down Jasmine's cross-examinations like sacred text. College professors framed the moment as a modern Selma, not because blood was shed, but because clarity had been. Activists began printing her closing line on posters, but Jasmine warned against turning her into a symbol too soon. "Don't put me on a mural," she said. "Put my questions into law." And in that one sentence, she redefined what legacy should look like. Not in bronze, but in policy. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.